Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston right now.
Yep. And today we're going to be talking about a much debated, discussed topic that's been going on as long as I've been in the movement, which is like over 20 years. We're going to be talking with Ben Case, who is an organizer, sociologist, researcher, writer, postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Work and Democracy. And he is the author of a new book that we're going to be talking about called Street Rebellion. Welcome to the Green and Red podcast, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. And so there's been a long-standing debate in the movement around violence and nonviolence, one side held by Gene Sharp and Erica Chenoweth and their followers, others with a sophisticated view on perspectives around self-defense, property destruction, confronting state and right-wing forces, which differ from Sharp and Chenoweth. So we're going to kind of just get into that a little bit. Maybe we could just start off with maybe you could just give us a little bit of a definition or context of rioting, which is like a big theme in your book, but just like kind of like start off there.
Yeah, absolutely. So rioting obviously is a fraught term, right? So we should just say that up front. There's a lot of different ways that we can use this term, and there's certain social theorists who've argued that we should abandon the term altogether as a descriptor because it's been over leveraged for rhetorical meaning, right? And then there's a lot of arguments, obviously in the US context and many other contexts, the word takes on racialized connotations. And so there's people who will argue that, for example, concerning Black uprisings against white supremacy, that the term riot has been used to disparage these moments of uprising, and therefore we should use other terms like rebellion or things like that. So we have to take that very seriously in context. And there's also all these different types of things that get conflated within the same term of rioting. And so the most important distinction I want to draw up front is, whatever terms we use, we have to distinguish between the types of collective political actions that are, so to speak, punching up versus punching down, right? We have to understand the direction that systemic power is flowing through an organized action. And because riots are chaotic and frightening and draw our attention, I think they're particularly susceptible to being confused in these ways. Even when we talk about things like race riots, that term sometimes gets applied. That can mean two very, very different things. Specifically in the U.S. context, at the beginning of the 20th century, the term race riot was typically used to describe white people attacking Black neighborhoods, basically mass lynch mobs, attacking Black people's property. Sometime around the middle of the 20th century, around the Watts riots particularly, the term shifts and starts getting used to apply to Black neighborhoods rebelling against police violence, against the institutionalized forms of white supremacy that were being enacted in those prior versions of what we might call race riots. So whatever we call them, we have to be very clear. These are two completely different social, political types of events. And so for the sake of distinguishing in my book, and when I talk about this, I call the first instance, which, in the US, we could think about like the Tulsa massacre in 1921 as a classic example, but there's many. Or we could think about anti-Jewish mob violence in Europe around the same time, or we could think about anti-Muslim violence in India, or we could think about settlers attacking Palestinians today, or things like that. Any sort of instance of a dominant racial or ethnic group attacking a marginalized group, I want to call a pogrom, just to distinguish it from what I'm calling a riot, which we could also call an anti-police riot, which is an instance of a a marginalized or impoverished or exploited, oppressed population rebelling against institutional violence, most typically sparked by direct police violence against community members. And those, those things we're calling riots have actually a fairly stable repertoire of actions, you might say, across time and space. You had people protesting in the streets and then destroying property or symbols of authority, destroying corporate property or looting stores. At least it's the term that's often applied to that, breaking into stores and liberating items from those stores, throwing projectiles at the police or setting cars on fire, building barricades in the streets. Those sorts of things is a particularly identifiable type of protest action, right? You sort of know it when you see it, and it can happen across contexts. It happens across time. So when I'm talking about a riot in the context of this book and this research, that's what I'm talking about.
Why has this become such a huge issue on the left? I know I teach U.S. history and I teach courses in radical history. So for a long time in colonial America, you had food riots and you had labor riots. And on the left, at least, it actually wasn't seen in such a negative way. Little steel strikes and things like, I've talked to people who were part of that, who went out with guns, and things like that. Yet today, I think, and Scott and I have been comrades and allies for a long time. We've had this discussion countless times with other people, and it evokes such huge emotions and anger, in fact, in a lot of people, who equated, like burning down a Target or putting a brick through a Target window with the police kneeling on someone's neck for almost 10 minutes. Right. What do you think, created that away from the idea that riots, could be, not such a bad idea?
Yeah, so let's talk about where that violence, nonviolence debate as we know it comes from, because as you pointed out at the beginning, Scott, anyone who's involved in social justice activism or is politically aware at all knows this debate, right? And you sort of know what side you're on. People kind of take a side almost as though we're rooting for sports teams, right? It's like people kind of know generally which one you adhere to, and depending on the specifics or the argument, your side might look a little better or a little worse, but we still there's not a whole lot of shifting that goes on. And that argument comes from a particular place, right? So I appreciate this question. If you go back again about a century, the argument was still there, but it was happening along very different lines. It was typically a moral argument. Right. So most famously, of course, Mohandas Gandhi is associated with the idea of nonviolence and pacifism. And for him, it was, of course, there was a strategic element to it, but really the purpose behind abstaining from violent action in rebellion against British colonialism had to do with people building, sort of fortifying their dignity and their spiritual character to take over and sort of run a newly freed nation. Right, so it had to do with a sort of development of a sense of empowerment among people who had been oppressed and occupied. And for him, drawing on Hindu traditions that a lot of people that were already organic and a lot of folks, this idea that you would have the discipline to refrain from fighting back was a method that Gandhi was using, was sort of arguing for achieving that type of transformation. And this is related to his own, maybe spiritual or religious commitments, which was typical of a lot of these arguments in the US. You see around the Catholic worker or the Quaker movements, or, this was wrapped up with spirituality and religion. And the same is true in many ways for Martin Luther King Jr., the other sort of considered kind of the other main name when we think about political nonviolence. Of course, there were strategic elements, but it was deeply intertwined with his interpretations and beliefs of Black Christian traditions. And this argument for moral nonviolence, of course, it's still there. But over the course of the 20th century, as decolonial movements exploded across the globe, it became clear to a lot of people that at least ethically speaking, oppressed and colonized people had a right to fight back. That moral argument kind of lost a lot of its traction. And one of the most famous thinkers around this is Frantz Fanon, who actually in many ways inverts what Gandhi is doing, right? For Fanon, the use of violence is not just an instrumental thing. It's not just about, sometimes violence is necessary. It's got to do with building a sense of dignity in oppressed peoples through fighting back. Whereas Gandhi saw it as through refraining from fighting back, Fanon saw the importance of fighting back in building a sense of empowerment and oppressed peoples to take control of their destinies and their nations. So that moral argument loses a lot of its traction. So the argument for nonviolence shifts, specifically around the work of this political scientist called Gene Sharp, who extracts from Gandhi's philosophy specifically the strategic and tactical elements and tries to distinguish them from the moral arguments and argue for what he calls strategic nonviolence. So the argument is not that we need to be nonviolent because nonviolence is better, or that it's somehow, will make us better people, or that we'll be able to, to fortify a better type of politics through nonviolence. We need to be nonviolent because it's more effective in transforming political conditions, right? It's an effective form of political combat, Sharp would say. And he has this whole architecture of logic around why this is the case, which all kind of revolves around, the consent to be governed. Right, the idea that regimes only have power because people sort of agree to be governed by them, which is an observation that is certainly not unique to Gene Sharp, but that he has this observation. So for him, the answer is, well, removing your consent to be governed. If you can organize that withdrawal of consent to be governed, you can shift political institutions or overthrow them even, because it drains them of their authority if people won't agree to be governed. And the most effective way to do that, he argues, is through nonviolent methods, because it's most approachable. It gets more people on board. It allows it to build faster. So that's Sharp's argument. And we can go down the Sharp rabbit hole if you want. He's a very complicated character and is bizarrely intertwined with the military industrial complex in ways that are really uncomfortable but important. But setting that aside for the moment, this argument comes to speak to folks on the left, I think, in subsequent decades. Sharp is writing in the early 70s, but in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, I think, compounding crises of capital, the clear and apparent failure of liberal democracies to live up to any of their promises, and the increasing publicity and transferred images of police violence against Black and brown and poor communities, and climate crises, frankly, and have I think imbued young people and movements with a real sense of urgency that we need to know what works. How do we make the change we need? So the strategic argument has been really effective in speaking to activists who just want to know how do we do it. We want to know how we can make the change, and they're saying, well, we have the answer. Nonviolent methods are more effective. So that kind of transforms the conversation. I think it becomes the standard around the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who we can talk about, who sort of empirically validate or claim to empirically validate that argument with data science, saying, look, we've studied the violent movements, the nonviolent movements, and we are showing you that nonviolence works better to overthrow governments.
Real quick,
yeah.
Before we get into Chenoweth, I actually have a couple questions about Sharp.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. Right. I have a couple of observations slash question. One, that the way in which that term is a little bit loaded. It's like strategic nonviolence. It's like, this is what's strategic. This is what's going to work versus like what's unstrategic. Like, armed struggle, from the Fanon camp or self-defense, community defense, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, you make a point of that. I'm wondering if you have any insight from your work around Sharp about how much of that was an intentional decision. I feel like the answer is probably yes, but I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. And then I have a second question about strategic nonviolence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, I think it was. I mean, the term itself, depending on how you're using it, I think the way it's often used contains within itself a logical fallacy. Right? The point of strategy is to assess conditions and organize your forces in order to achieve a goal. if you're starting from the get-go with the idea of how you're going to do that, that's not strategic, just on its face, right? If you already know the avenue you want to take, then you're not really doing strategy. What they're doing is they're trying to make a strategic, I'm talking about the people in the nonviolence field, but specifically Gene Sharp. What Gene Sharp is trying to do is not assess all the different options and then see which works best, right? Which Chenoweth and Stefan claim to do. What Sharp is doing is saying, I think nonviolence works better. I think you probably think that too, you, the reader, or whoever. So I'm going to give you all these arguments for why that's true. You know, he was a committed pacifist himself when he was younger, and I think that this is a sort of an attempt to make an argument that he thought was, you know, he thought the rebuttal to some of the moral nonviolent arguments from a lot of the violence people was that, well, it doesn't work. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work. You need to use violence to achieve your goals. So Sharp was trying to say, no, you don't. Here's this argument actually for how nonviolence is an effective way to achieve political goals. There's a lot of problems there, though, because what he's really doing, it's not an exploratory project; it's a confirmatory project, right? He's looking for evidence that confirms his argument. He's not trying to challenge it, and so what you get is all these just mistellings of history, right? I mean, like Robert, like you were talking about how, you know, the labor movement really came together and became powerful around the use of physical force, either to destroy or sabotage machinery, or to fight with strikebreakers and scabs. Or
10,000 armed workers in West Virginia.
Yeah, absolutely. The mine wars.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and you know, I'm living in the place that's called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now, where there was, you know, the homestead strike. You can go today and you can see the bullet holes where the workers were fighting with the Pinkertons, the mercenaries that the companies hired, you know, Carnegie and Frick and them hired to come in and fight with them. Right. So this was an inherent part of defending the power of the strike. Right. So Sharp views the labor strike as this abstraction, this idea of, well, the fundamental aspect of a strike is you're refusing to work, right? Okay, the means of production rely on labor power. So if you refuse to give your labor power, that's fundamentally a nonviolent intervention. Well, it seems like that abstractly, but in reality, defending that withdrawal of labor has meant often physically defending it. Less so today, but there's a whole history behind how that happened and why the labor movement is so much less powerful than it had the potential, at least, to be at the turn of the 20th century. So it involves these mistellings of history, telling the history of labor power as a nonviolent story, for example. And other examples that are just like really egregious to anyone who has any sense of revolutionary history. I mean, Sharp wants to describe the 1905 and 1917 Russian revolutions as primarily nonviolent events, which is just, I mean, you know, it's just, I don't even have the words to describe the like insincerity of something like that.
I finish your point, but I have another question, which is connected.
No, I could go on forever.
It's all good. It's all good. My other question, because it's like a field, the study of civil resistance is a field, which I feel like there's even like, you know, departments at universities around this. But then the other piece, which, you know, one of the things that we like to do on the show is like contrast like liberal thought versus left thought. And so it seems like part of the strategic nonviolence, some of the strategy is to actually, you know, there's like this process of like depoliticizing, you know, resistance and, you know, make it nonviolent, make it nice, make it we're asking nicely, but if not, we'll sit in. And I have built a career on like organizing people to do direct action and do sit-ins and things like that. So I'm a big proponent of it. But you know, I also want it to be like politicized, and I think there's like that's the important part is the politics. It's like we're resisting capital, we're resisting the state, we're trying to do something about climate change. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of this. Politics doesn't show up in Sharp's work at all. You know, there's this idea of the state and sort of a very rudimentary theory of power concerning the state, but there's no politics beyond that. And Sharp is even upfront that he's ambivalent about the use of his tactics to, you know, attack what he would call legitimate governments, but he doesn't specify what legitimate means, and what illegitimate should mean. He kind of uses words like tyranny sometimes, but doesn't explain what that means. So he's really just trying to describe a method of political action on its own, completely distinguished from any reasons why you would use it. Which, and this ties into the uses of that, of those tactics by, for example, U.S. foreign policy and, military, special operations or special warfare departments. There's all this, there's all this. Well, I don't want to go too far. It's tempting to go down a conspiratorial rabbit hole here, but there are very clear uses, not just in theory but in practice right now of U.S. Psychological and special warfare operations deploying these sorts of training manuals.
The 198 methods.
Right, exactly, to inspire and to train activists in enemy states. I was just talking to someone the other day after talking about this book, who is an activist from Nicaragua, who was talking about, who said he was invited not long ago to an activist training for activists from Nicaragua and El Salvador and Venezuela and Cuba. I'm sure that it was coincidence, those countries, that was sponsored by USIP, the U.S. Institute for Peace, where Maria Stefan works now, one of the authors of Why Civil Resistance Works. Where they were training people in these nonviolent methods. And when activists said, well, this isn't going to work, they pointed to this work in civil resistance studies. This is, no, we've studied it. It does work better. So again, there's no politics as part of it. So it can be deployed by whoever. And it can at the same time be sort of pitched as something that's part of movements everywhere. It's part of movements in the US, and the left has picked it up and run with it. But I think when you do that, you have to be aware, and I'm on the same page. I mean, I think that certainly, the problem with the violence, nonviolence debate, or one of the problems, is that all these flaws in these nonviolence arguments can get sort of snowballed into this argument for other folks that, well, all this stuff is garbage and we can't use it. Not at all. Some of these are very useful methods and tactics, and are important. But in using them alone, because the arguments for nonviolence are always purist in this way, right? They're always made as though there can't be any intrusion of violence. The word itself kind of implies that, nonviolence. When you're using those alone, you're drastically limiting your tactical and strategic toolkit, but also, as you pointed to, also you're cutting off access to the sort of political genealogies of different types of resistance that would connect you to revolutionary struggles in places that are not using nonviolence.
Yeah, I didn't want to say take a weapon out of your arsenal. I don't like that, but in this particular case, and I think the left often doesn't understand the difference between strategies and tactics, which I think is kind of something you're saying. But when you begin this whole process by saying we're not going to be violent, we're not going to have riots, and that means like we're not going to put a brick through a window. I mean, you just kind of it's a clean slate. They kind of you're starting at such a huge deficit, because the state can then use that against you, and you're kind of in a sense like really mollifying them and letting them I mean, obviously the Wobblies didn't do that, and the CIO didn't do that, and even segments of the civil rights movement didn't do that. And King obviously was not violent, but he certainly understood why people raged in Newark and in Watts and in Detroit and everywhere else. So again, I mean, you talked about this as a moral and a strategic issue. And I keep going back. I think like the Vietnamese had this idea, what they call revolutionary morality. And a lot of American leftists in the 60s, kind of adopted that, like kind of taking it to where we are today, like kind of post George Floyd uprising. Do you think there's kind of and by the way, this is something we're gonna have to have you back on, because I could see this being like an ongoing conversation, because this is something that Scott and I, and I've talked, I mean, we've been discussing this for decades, really. But post George Floyd, do you think that this is there's shifting terrain on this, where especially younger people, I think of like the kids of Portland, I call them kids because I'm an old man, but like the Antifas, who are actually going toe to toe, because the right has never, forsaken violence, obviously. And so when you say we're not going to be violent, we're not even going to put a brick through a bank window, and you have the Proud Boys and all those guys out there where they are, as you've kind of, I mean, frankly, almost lost a battle before you get started.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean,
Sorry about that. It
no,
was more of
it's
a rant than a question. Yeah.
no, I want to be in discussion. That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a big part of what inspired me to take on this research project and write this book is the fact that this is a recurring argument.
Yeah.
And I think it's a sorry, you hear my kid in the background there maybe, but it's a recurring argument. And I think it's it serves a destructive function in movements too often, where we get bogged down in this argument and fighting each other over it, when in reality, if you look at any moment of uprising, from a sort of insurrectionary moment of uprising all the way through to a whole sort of revolutionary moment, they're always, or asterisk on always, but almost always, they involve the sorts of actions you'd call violent and the sorts of actions you'd call nonviolent. They involve both. So if we're going to understand that, if we're going to build toward that, we have to reach a point where we understand at least the ways that these can coexist and potentially act symbiotically. That doesn't mean every individual has to engage in actions that run the whole spectrum, but they're all there. And the George Floyd uprising is a perfect and tragic example. I'm just working my way through this book that just came out, the George Floyd uprising, by a collective called Vortex Group. It just came out from PM Press. Fantastic work that really tries to dig into moment to moment, what happened. The people who make meaning of these uprisings after the fact, you talked about the difference between liberals and radicals, or liberals and revolutionaries. It's the liberals who tend to make meaning of this. They have louder voices in the media, and they have more funding in their organizations. But if we go back to some of those moments, in Minneapolis, those few days after Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, we learn a lot about this debate itself. And you go through that moment to moment, there were people who were demonstrating nonviolently the whole time, and there were people, and when demonstrators got attacked by police, there were also people who counterattacked and set police vehicles on fire and ended up burning down the 3rd precinct. But all the while, there were people who were demonstrating nonviolently in different parts of the city, and sometimes in the very same places. These were all going on at the same time. Then you have these narratives that come in after the fact and try to make us filter it through this violence, nonviolence thing. But no, this is a deeply complicated and moment when all this stuff was present. And I think that in response to your other question, yes, I mean, I really do think that moment has shifted the conversation. I don't know if that shift will last. I think we have to help make it last. I think we have to help continue that momentum, because otherwise there's always that, again, there's always the liberal voices that are trying to roll us back into the same destructive arguments. But I really did feel a shift in the way people were talking about it in my lifetime in movements. I've been involved in organizing since I was in high school, and that's a long time ago for me now, a couple decades ago. And so in my relatively short time in movements, but still decades, there was a new quality to the way people were talking about this after that moment. I think there was a sort of a visceral understanding that that sometimes these types of responses and reactions are necessary. There was a poll, I think it was I can't remember, I don't want to get it wrong, it was USA Today, but there was a national poll right after the uprising in Minneapolis that showed that 54% of
it was USA Today. It was USA Today. We talked about it a lot.
I thought it was Newsweek, but I remember.
54% thought that the burning of the 3rd precinct
and large majority supported defunding. They supported Black Lives Matter. That's right. Even though they had that momentum, I remember Biden and Bernie Sanders and everybody stepping in and saying, "Oh no, we can't do this. We got to give the cops more money. You got to stop doing this stuff."
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, Biden's that's a whole other.
Well, yeah. That's another show.
No, but but I think it's worth focusing on that for a moment, right? In that moment, a majority, that's a nationwide poll. That wasn't just people locally, right? People who are far away. Why? If you had taken that poll 2 weeks earlier, there's no way you probably wouldn't have made it out of single digits. No. If it was just an abstraction, people would say no. But why? Because people had just seen that video, right? That video was everywhere, and it was just enraging and heartbreaking. And after seeing that video, you don't know what to do with that. And then you see people who did something, who burned down the 3rd precinct, people say, yeah, you know what? I'm so mad, that is justified. In that moment, that's how that felt. That was accessing some reality there through all of the noise, right, that gets imposed on us. But then you give, right, so then there's this campaign to defund and disband, in fact, the police in Minneapolis and replace it with a, sort of community support system. And it has a ton of support. But between then and when they actually hold the referendum, which is a year later, right, you give the police time, you give the media time to re-inspire that kind of like standard, order and policing and fear of crime and that sort of thing. You give people time, you give that time, and those numbers shift. Now, they don't shift entirely, right? They still, I think it was 40-something%, 46 or 47% voted for something like that, voted for that referendum. So it lost. But still, if you had taken that, again, just in the abstract a year prior, or, before the uprising, you wouldn't have gotten very many votes at all. So it was a major shift. That in and of itself, I think is significant, even though in our sort of 50% plus one vote system, it loses. The fact that you have that many people who are willing to say, no, we need to get rid of this entire institution is really significant. But it shows the power of actions like what we could call riots to sometimes emotionally break through the narratives that we've all become used to about the status quo in the society we live in, and who's the good guys and who's the bad guys kind of thing. That just like endless reruns of Law and Order that we all watch if you're like you can't sleep or you're whatever. It's like all that sort of stuff is deep in there. For a moment, you can break through that sometimes with those sorts of actions.
Just to shift it a little bit, because I have definitely two other things I want to hit on. One of which is I want to talk a little bit about Erica Chenoweth, which is just the sort of like newer, more recent argument that Sharp was making. She and Stefan put out the book Why Civil Resistance Works. It claims to be a sort of data-based argument about nonviolence revolutions being more effective than armed struggle and things like that. And you kind of like take that apart in your book. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of a background on that, and then talk about NAVCO and some of that.
Right. Okay. So that book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, comes out in 2011. Comes out at a perfect time for them. Right? This is a moment of global uprising. It really feels like we're in maybe another 1968 moment, right? Across the world. There's all these uprisings. And this book comes out and claims to be able to explain why there's so many uprisings and why so many of them are being successful, right? Starting at the beginning of that year in Tunisia and Egypt, and then spreading across the world. And it's saying it's because of nonviolence. It's going back to Gene Sharp's. It doesn't talk a lot about Gene Sharp. It basically recycles a lot of Gene Sharp's arguments. It's part of that same, field of study you talked about, civil resistance studies. And so what it does, but it claims to assess it empirically. So they build this data set called NAVCO, Nonviolent and Violent Conflicts and Outcomes. There's a bunch of versions now. But initially, the idea was to examine what they call primarily violent strategies to overthrow the state and primarily nonviolent strategies. And they compare them for efficacy on basically a binary variable. Do they or do they not overthrow the state at the peak of their campaign? And again, there's a lot there we could critique and unpack, and I get to some of it in the book. There's even more, I think, but chapter 3 goes in depth on that. But even on that basis alone, the primarily violent campaigns come from another data set in political science. It's called the Correlates of War data set, which catalogs all armed conflicts going back to, I think, 1816. And the subset of those, that's intrastate conflict. So basically civil wars. Looking at civil wars between two armed parties where they're shooting at each other, and there's at least 1,000 battle-related casualties. So quite a high threshold for inclusion in that data set. Armed, hot civil war conflict. Okay, that's the primarily violent struggle. Primarily nonviolent, they compose themselves with their colleagues. And this is mass protest in the streets, what we would today recognize as a moment of uprising, right? In the image of Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011, or all the ones since, has become much more standard as a sort of method of uprising. They call that primarily nonviolent. But there's no measure in the data for any type of violence that falls below the threshold for war. They have this radical flank variable, but that has to do with like a country where there's armed struggle and unarmed struggle happening at the same time. But there's no variable or no measure at all for riots, which are, again, the sort of main type of action that draws our attention and sparks these kinds of arguments. It just goes away in the data. What it does is it, like any riots that take place during unarmed movements, in reality, they contribute to those movements succeeding or failing, which I also have an issue with that binary succeeding and failing, but let's put that aside for the moment. They contribute to that, but in the data, that contribution gets counted as nonviolence because it's just erased, it goes away. So that was my main intervention, was saying, okay, look, let's take data on riots that's comparable and let's stick it into the supposedly nonviolent campaigns in NAVCO, and you find that the vast majority of them include major riots, or 80% just looking at the data. But of course, the data is also limited, especially with smaller countries and long ago. So if you go by case, if you go through case by case, you bring that number up to almost 100%. Almost 100% of the cases we'd call a nonviolent revolution include major riots.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No,
go
ahead.
I'll just say, and so Chenoweth uses that data in that book. Then when there are actual riots in the U.S., like let's talk about January 20th, 2017, she talks about how, see, look at my data. This is why the tactics that were being used at the Trump inauguration didn't work. And then you have 400 or 500 people who are, charged with felonies from the DC police.
Yeah, and that article actually, speaking frankly, that article actually changed my perception of Chenoweth and their work, because it showed a couple things. First of all, I'm quite sure that Chenoweth knows that would not have been in that data set. Once the data, is updated until today, the Trump resistance was counted as a primarily nonviolent movement, which I also think is problematic because it wasn't a maximalist campaign, whatever. But either way, those actions on January 20th, smashing the Starbucks and the bank windows and burning the limousine and, punching Richard Spencer in the face, that does not merit qualification for a civil war. That would not be counted as violence in that data set. So to use the evidence from that data set that shows that the nonviolent struggles are more effective and turn it around to say, well, because this is happening, this is going to reduce the efficacy of resistance against the Trump regime, is disingenuous. I don't really know how else to put it, or I guess I don't know a nicer way to put it, I should say. I do know other ways I could put it. And specifically, I saw that article, it was in the New Republic, and I saw that being used on social media to argue against doing support work for the 200 plus people who were facing felony riot charges. Some of them, were some of them friends of mine. And full disclosure, I was there that day. And so I know what happened. I was lucky. Me too. Yeah, I was lucky enough not to be kettled. And but I was very committed to that on a personal basis in a lot of ways. And so to see that being used by people who are saying no, these folks are going to ruin the movement. We shouldn't be doing support work for them. I suppose being honest, it did fuel my desire to unpack some of these things and clarify for folks what's actually going on in these in this research that's being used in all these ways. People don't understand what's actually in there.
Yeah, I mean, we've all run into people like that who I personally kind of find disgusting, but we're kind of close to the end here. And I'm serious. I really want to have this as an ongoing discussion. So we have to talk to you again, because this is something I think that's really, really important. But this is kind of a little more specific, but if people work there, do you have any ideas about the actual targets of aggressive actions or direct actions? I don't even know if we want to call them violence, because what kind of spurs me, and this is actually in some ways I kind of deviate from a lot of the left people I know. Like in 2020, the initial attacks on monuments, I think, I was cheering them on, burn it down, But after a few weeks, going after monuments and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, Christopher Columbus, I think it kind of played out. And I just wondered if you have any ideas, or if there have been studies on is it more effective to burn, topple a Confederate monument, put a brick through Bank of America. We don't have Kyle Rittenhouses on the left, so that's not even really a consideration. But Is there, do you have some thoughts on like what, if you are going to be more aggressive to the point where there's a riot or violence or however you want to define it, how should that, what should that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, of course, we don't have Kyle Rittenhouses on the left, thank the gods and goddesses or whoever. But we do have armed community defense folks who are having that conversation more and more, I think. Well, that's a separate conversation. So for the sake of time, let's bracket that for the moment. I don't have data to back up a sort of argument around which targets are most effective, although that's a really interesting question. I think, but before we started speaking, Scott, you mentioned the question of like, do riots work, right? Which is a lot of times the way this sort of argument plays out. And one of the things I want to do, which I know is dissatisfying for a lot of folks, but I want to step back and ask, work to do what? Let's pause for a moment. Working and not working has everything to do with what our goals are. And sometimes the goal is a specific immediate outcome, of course, like getting rid of a statue. But sometimes the goal is different. Sometimes the goal is sending a message. Sometimes the goal is emotional. Sometimes the goal has to do with the way people feel in their bodies, their ability to fight back. And I think that really varies from place to place. I mean, I've certainly seen actions that I think are strategically stupid. For example, in someone, smashing the window of some local family-owned store or something. This is has no hope of building any kind of power, in my opinion. Whereas, potentially a certain bank or corporation or government office or statue could theoretically have a ton of impact. I mean, one of the case studies I examined through interviews in the book is in South Africa, a student uprising in 2015-16 that was sparked by someone vandalizing a statue of Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town. So in that instance, that ended up sort of catching fire, so to speak, and spreading into all these other campaigns. I do agree that in certain instances, there's kind of a palpable sense that repeating the same action doesn't necessarily have the same effect today as it did yesterday and the day before. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And I think those sorts of things have to be sorted out in real time and context. There might be ways to explore sort of a more objective understanding of which work better and worse, but if there are, I haven't come across them. But it's a good question.
I'm going over a little bit, but I have one other thing I just wanted to, something somewhat topical, is that, we're seeing some of this kind of play out right now in Atlanta around the assassination of forest defender Gita. We've done a couple shows on Atlanta forest defense. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or comment on, we're seeing the diversity of tactics play out there where people have been sitting in trees. We've seen, groups advocating through legitimate means to fight the permits or bird dog the mayor. But then we've also seen, more confrontational tactics, whether it's, mixing it up with the police or arson and sabotage. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, on the face of it, most people who are activists who've engaged in direct action know that the police will generally call you violent if they want to use violence against you. And that can be very that can be very acute. Like if you get beat up by the cops in an action and then arrested, it's very likely they'll charge you with assaulting an officer to sort of retroactively justify what's happened. And that's what we saw, with the really tragic murder of Tortuguita, where, the police say, well, they shot at us. Right. Of course, they're going to say, I don't know if that's true or not, but now it comes out, it looks like it very likely was the cops shooting each other. Right. And what was more likely, of course, that a forest defender is going to open fire on heavily armed police, or that police are going to accidentally shoot at each other. So it's not a shock to me that it turns out that wasn't true. But it is important to remember that language is always going to be used for a political purpose by authorities in order to try to demonize movements, and they'll call sitting in the forest violent, right? They'll call blocking traffic violent. They'll call whatever they have to violent.
And they are calling it terrorism. They are calling it terrorism there. So
right, terrorism.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's
from the country that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah, Orwell couldn't have come up with that.
You blow up a pipeline, but don't put a hammock in the forest. Yeah.
Sure. No, exactly. I mean, so I think that so we have to be conscious, I think, on the left when we talk about these things, about how these words will be used. But I think that it's also counterintuitive. Right? So a lot of people will argue, well, therefore, we have to, maintain nonviolent discipline, or at least describe these things as nonviolent. I think it's actually more complicated than that. I think we have to reclaim our understanding of what resistance actually means and looks like, and understand that it's the word violence or the specific actions you'd call violent are used politically by authorities. That doesn't mean we have to accept that. It also doesn't mean we have to cut out any sort of action that could be called those things from our repertoire because of it. I think we have to reclaim our sense of how we're resisting in ways that are building power, in ways that are disrupting systems of oppression and domination, and be having those conversations ourselves. And to the extent that the violence, nonviolence question, having to litigate which it is destructive and starts fights, I want to just move beyond that. Let's actually talk about resistance and not force ourselves to fight over if it's violent or nonviolent. Let's talk about what we need to do. Let's talk about, what works and what doesn't. Yes, but also like what we need to build power, what our communities need to feel safe and defend themselves.
Yeah, I don't know if I just want to say thank you. And, to me, it's really important also just to have this discussion openly, because I know for so long, I've had this discussion, but people would always say, well, you can't talk about this, and I actually really appreciate the fact that you are, having this discussion. And I think it does need to be like, kind of publicly discussed by people who want to change this world. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on. Appreciate actually how much your book has been been trying to shift the conversation and shift the debate here. I think it's very important, and definitely we'd love to have you come back on again sometime in the future.
Cheers.
So, So thanks for joining. Folks, you've been listening to Ben Case, who's the author of a new book that we've been discussing called Street Rebellion, and we'll talk to y'all again soon. Before we wrap up, I just want to talk about a friend of mine. This week, my friend, longtime comrade, I've been friends with her for 17 years. Her name's Jen Angel. Folks may have seen some media around Jen, seen a lot of social media around her. She passed away. She was actually injured pretty badly in a robbery in Oakland, which I'm not going to get too much in. Well, I'm going to get a little bit into the details, but not in the way in which the local sensationalist media wants to. But I actually just want to talk about my friend Jen a little bit. Jen is a longtime activist. She was a media activist, definitely since she was in high school, when she started making the zines that were, wildly circulated. She later became a co-founder of Clamor magazine, which was a media outlet, which, we talk about media influencers now, and we have memes and things like that. Jen was a real media influencer. She created this magazine, which was commented on like radical culture and punk and anarchism. I actually did an interview with her in the last year. It ran from like 1999 to 2006 about my experience in getting kicked out of Australia. She was also early on working in indie media back in those days. Here in the Bay Area, she also was an organizer of the Bay Area Anarchist Book Fair. And then she was also briefly a member of Rising Tide North America with me too, many years ago as well. But she passed away. I'll also say that Jen was the heart of many communities. And as she sort of like moved away from as much activism as she had done, she actually got involved in owning a small business, and she ran a bakery and was an event planner for still like radical events and radical people. But she had started a bakery that was in a neighborhood in West Oakland. The name of the bakery was Angel Cakes. And then Folks who were her friends in her close circle were a little bit concerned because a lot of the media around Jen's attack was coming out, and it was basically trying to be framed as like a downtown Oakland crime story. And so they've put out a statement, and it's a longer statement, but I'm going to just read a portion of it. But I just want to just like say this because I think it's important to say. And all of our audience are kind of people who have the same politics as Jen. Hopefully, most of you out there. But I also just want to read this. We know Jen would not want to continue the cycle of harm by bringing state-sanctioned violence to those involved in her death or to other members of Oakland's rich community. As a longtime social movement activist and anarchist, Jen did not believe in state violence, carceral punishment, or incarceration as an effective or just solution to social violence and inequity. Jen's family has asked that traditional prosecution be avoided in her case and alternatives such as restorative justice be employed instead. So Jen Angel, rest in power, my friend. And it's going to be hard going on without her. So anyway, thanks folks for listening. Check this out on all the channels. I'm not going to go into them today, but we'll talk to you again soon.
Tenement dives head first into the fray and into the argument. Time skips a beat and moves on. He stays true to his will. I can still hear Marcy calling down from the windowsill. If you stick around, you can sleep in my bed again. Don't leave now. If you do, it'll really be the that tear. We're still here, dancing to that crooked beat of Sainted Street.